All right, thank you everyone for attending this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist. And this week our topic is a repeat of a session I did at the Xojo Developer Conference back in March called the Pragmatic Programmer. And this session is not specifically about Xojo. It is about, hang on, I got a question here. Let's see, a couple questions. All right, let me just finish my little spiel here and I'll look at the questions. So this is not going to be specific about Xojo. It's going to cover more broader development topics that will certainly apply to Xojo, but can apply to anything as well. Unfortunately, because you're listening to this as a webinar, you don't get to see me standing in front of you, making funny faces, waving my arms around and all that stuff. But hopefully the content is still useful for all of you. All right, so before I get started, let's see. Dwayne is asking quickly if the example projects from the object-oriented programming webinar from a couple weeks ago are available. And yes, they are available on the video page in the language reference. So you can kind of head right over here to this URL. And I got to fix a little page break there, it looks like. But the example projects are right here. So you can grab those if you did attend the webinar and want to grab the example projects. And Justin is also asking if I can record the screen with ScreenFlow. And I could theoretically, but the user account I'm working with at the moment is not configured for that. I need to update that with some extra tools so I can have a backup of a recording. Actually, the corruption from last time didn't corrupt the video, it only corrupted the audio, go figure. So I'm still working to see if I can overdub that. Or there may be some special webinar you see announced where I redo the whole object-oriented programming webinar again so I can get a clean recording. But with that out of the way, let's talk about pragmatic programming. So this is entirely a keynote presentation, which means I won't actually see questions as they're typed. So what I'm going to try and do is take a break in the middle. I'll run the polls and then take a look at the list of questions and address them there. The way Keynote works, it hides all my screens, including the control panel that shows the questions. All right, pragmatic programmer. So what does it mean to be pragmatic? Well, if you've ever used this word in a sentence, you might have an idea, but it's dealing with things sensibly, being practical rather than pie in the sky theory and always doing things the right way, even if they may be the bad way. So we're going to talk about things you can do in the process of software development that can help you make sure that you're able to actually produce your software. Now, the first thing, before you do anything, is always think. Think, think, think. Tools like Xojo make it really easy to just dive right in and start coding. You can, jump in, fire up Xojo, go right in there, open up a code editor, layout window, start dragging things around, start typing code in. That's fun, but that's not often the best idea for your software project. So even though you may be really eager to just jump right in and start, banging things out, take a step back, think about what you're trying to do first. Maybe do a little bit of research to see what techniques, tips, things that other people have done that may apply to what you're trying to do. If you're modifying an existing project, you might even just want to start by reviewing existing code. So again, just diving right in and monkeying around and making changes is always a risky proposition. And it's always great to have a plan. Now, it doesn't need to be anything, formal that you're putting in Microsoft Project or anything like that. Goodness, that could take you longer than doing the actual project. But at least having a rough idea of how much time you think what you're going to do is going to take. It's always good to know that. to have an idea. You know, do you think this is going to be an easy thing to accomplish or something that might take a while? Have an idea. And of course, talking about what you're going to do with other people is a great way to get ideas fleshed out, to see if they're going to make sense, or to have people tell you, oh, I've tried that before and that's crazy. Don't go down that path. You're going to regret it. Now, that can be hard for people that work independently by themselves, you know, maybe in their own office or cubicle or whatnot. But if you are in an office, you probably have other people you can touch base with. Another great place to discuss things when you're dealing with Xojo is head on over to the Xojo forum. Lots of great discussions happen there all the time. It's very active. I think there's a thread there that's now eclipsed 2,000 posts. Of course, that's not necessarily a programming related thread. But it's a great way to just, you know, shoot the breeze with people. Sometimes you can help figure out an alternative way to solve something that you might be stuck on. And related to planning is estimating how long something's going to take. And I did mention that when I talk about planning, but one of the reasons to plan is to get an idea of how long you're going to spend on something. You don't necessarily just want to be going into something and you're cracking your knuckles and get started and say, okay, I'm just going to work on this till I'm done. That's usually not realistic. You're going to have some idea of how long something's going to take, or you're going to need to box yourself in and say, okay, I'm going to give myself this amount of time to get where I need to be. And if I can't accomplish everything I need to, well, hopefully I have enough pieces so I can move on to the next thing. So estimates are always a great thing to have. And of course, if you work for someone else, odds are they're going to expect you to give estimates. And it's always really important when you're giving people estimates to set expectations appropriately and remind people of the definition of estimate, which is that it's kind of a guess. I've worked for managers in the past that expected you to give an estimate and then expected it to be completely precise. And it's not a precise, it's an estimate. It can't be precise. And I would get into arguments with managers over that. I finally stopped those arguments during a meeting. Manager called a meeting and was complaining about the developer's estimates not being precise enough. So I asked this manager how long his meeting was going to take. And he was, I don't know, about an hour. And I said, no, I need to know precisely how long it's going to take, down to the minute. I have things to work on, apparently. And he didn't think it was that funny, but everyone else kind of did. But he stopped being quite so stringent about those estimates after he got that little lesson. All right. Lastly here, don't be a slave to formal methods. There's lots of programming methodologies out there that you've heard of, waterfall, agile, test-driven development. You don't necessarily have to pick one and then say, okay, this is exactly how I'm always going to do my projects. You can pick and choose and steal things from them so that you can have what works for your project. So don't let yourself become a slave to formal methods that you may have read about or have used in the past. Now, a good goal to have when creating software is to always just make it better than it was. Just improve things. One of the best ways to do this is care about what you do. If you care about what you're creating, you're just instinctually going to want to make it better. You're going to want to fix bad designs. Everyone has bad designs. What you thought was a great design 6 months ago may be the worst design ever today. And don't just live with it because that's what you decided 6 months ago. Fix it. Think about a different way to do it. Correct your wrong decisions. Everyone's going to have wrong decisions. And the thing about software is it's generally meant to be changeable. So you can fix these decisions. You don't want to let your software become brittle and fragile because it's got one bad design on top of another bad design. Excuse me, because you're not updating this poor code. So always improve it. Make it better than it was. And this can be even if in code you're not even necessarily adding to a project. Maybe you happen to be in a completely different class and you notice one of the methods that you're using, you go to review it, it has some problems. You could go in and clean it up. Always make the code better. And that's called managing your code debt, so that you don't get to a point where your code is all of a sudden years old, years out of date, impossible for anyone to understand and work with, and then everyone is afraid to touch it because no one understands how it works. And that's a bad situation to get into, and that's the sort of thing where software stagnates. People are like, that's it, we got to throw the project away. We'll have to start over from scratch because the project got to such a point that it is unmaintainable. You don't want that to happen. But related to all this is the phrase, perfect is the enemy of good. There's no reason to have everything be 100% perfect the first time out. This is software. There's no product that's ever shipped that has ever been bug-free. And if you're trying to achieve that, you're never going to ship anything. But you want to make it good enough so that it's useful for people. So don't dwell on the perfect, dwell on the good, and continue to make it better than it was. As I mentioned, all software has bugs. So one way to make things a little bit easier, have less bugs, that sort of thing, is to do less. So at the very beginning, ignore specific details so you don't get caught up in how you're going to implement things and stuff that will prevent you from actually solving the problem. And one of the most important things about dealing with software is to ship early and ship often. Build something that's useful, get it out there, let people start using it, and completely ship another one very quickly. And do this repeatedly. This is how software gets better over time, and all of a sudden, something is awesome. You see this all the time with software products. And of course, less software means less bugs. And you're not going to need it. If there's a feature you think might be really cool, seriously consider whether your software really needs it to be added to. If you don't add it, there's no chance you're going to have bugs there. And often people spend a lot of time adding features to software that never even gets used. And that's a shame. That's a waste of time, a waste of money, and you've probably added some free bugs to your software there as well. So think hard about features. I think Steve Jobs has a quote that he was always more proud of the things Apple said no to than the things they actually did. And it's hard to say no to things, especially when people are asking you for them, but sometimes you do have to. So think hard about that. And another quote here, minor little thing, but it's important. Half, not half-assed. Do the right half, but don't just do, I'll do whatever, doesn't matter what it is. Think hard, pick what your users are going to need, and do that. And of course, related to all this, beware the bloat monster. Don't end up with your software becoming this gigantic thing that has everything in the kitchen sink in it that becomes a maintenance nightmare, becomes difficult for the users to work with, and becomes difficult for you to work on. Nobody wants that. So how can you get better at making software? Well, you can always be coding. Open source projects are a great way to always be coding. There's lots of open source projects available in Xojo, of course, and in anything else that you're interested in. You can actually find a list of the many Xojo open source projects in our documentation wiki on the community resources page. Many projects available. And you may have heard the 10,000 hours rule, which it's a general saying that people say you need about 10,000 hours of experience in something before you can be considered an expert in it. That's a lot of hours. And writing code all the time, great way to get up there. You can also modify and learn from other people's code. So even if you're not necessarily going to contribute to an open source project, you can grab those projects and look at the code that other people wrote and learn from it. Xojo itself includes well over 200 example projects that you can grab and read through and see code as well. The other thing is always be learning, kind of a corollary to the always be coding. And there are great ways to learn. You can go to conferences. In particular, I did this session originally at our Xojo Developer Conference, which we do every year. We just recently announced next year's conference, which is going to be in Austin. It's not available for registering or anything like that yet, but the dates I'll bring up on our website. I don't have them right in front of me at the moment. I believe they're at the end of April of 2015. So that's one option. There are plenty of other conferences that are always available to go to. You can get training. You can attend webinars. What a great idea. You can read about programming topics. There's a great Xojo magazine you can subscribe to. The forum is a great way to read about people discussing things about Xojo. There's lots of other books in general that aren't necessarily Xojo specific, but have great information that you can apply to your Xojo projects and development career. And of course, you can always just try new things. And of course, one of the greatest ways to learn something yourself is to try to teach it to someone else, because then you realize that you hardly know it at all, and everyone ends up learning more. Now, don't guess when you're coding. I see this a lot. This is a quote from Gene Kranz, the flight director of the Apollo 13 mission. It's work the problem, people. Let's not make things worse by guessing. When you're creating software, it's pretty deterministic. That's kind of the point of computers. You do something, there's an expected outcome. You should have a pretty good idea what that expected outcome is. Test what these assumptions are that you are expecting, but don't just be happy that something works and then panic when it doesn't. That kind of would imply you got lucky that it worked in the first place and that you're not going to be able to fix it when something goes wrong. So don't ever panic. There's almost always a solution to the problem. And another thing I see a lot is that there's a phrase here, select is not broken. Now, select here is referring to the SQL select command, but it refers to generally any command that's in any programming language. Generally speaking, those commands aren't broken. They're used by thousands upon thousands of people in thousands upon thousands of applications, and they're well tested and they're focused and they're probably not broken. So if you have some issues related to that, odds are it's not the statement itself, but it might be the code you wrote around it. So the fact that the core, you shouldn't consider the core as being the problem initially. Could end up being the problem, certainly. Not just, as I mentioned earlier, every software has bugs, but that's usually not the place to start. Related to that is no dead ends. There are always multiple ways to solve a problem. So you can find solutions and not have to make excuses. So this means you can have different ways to solve a certain thing. Maybe you need to save a file. Your app needs to save a file, and you're having trouble doing that as text. All right, well, maybe your plain text format you've devised isn't going to work for the particular thing. Well, don't just throw your hands up and say, that's it, I'm done, I'm out. I can't do this anymore. There's no way to save this in a plain text format. Well, maybe you could use a database as your file format. Maybe you could use JSON or XML or something else. Maybe there's a different way to encode your information before you put it in the plain text file. Maybe the information that's giving you trouble could be in a separate file that is referred to by a different file. There's lots of options that you could throw on the table to see if they work for what you're trying to solve. There's not only one way. So just if you happen to hit a dead end, back up immediately and say, all right, what are my options? I always like when I'm coming up with proposals for people is to have multiple options right there out in front so that the people that you're building the software for are very comfortable that you'll be able to solve their problem no matter what problems come up in the creation of the software. Writing. It's very important to be able to write. After all, English, I got a little asterisk here, just a programming language, English or whatever language you happen to speak or write, is just another language. And it's important because of communication. If you can't write well, how are you going to be able to communicate to other people? If you're a consultant, how are you going to be able to create a proposal that your client is going to trust and understand and be comfortable with? How are you going to be able to write emails that people are going to be able to understand and decipher and work with? You can practice your writing by having a blog. Blogs are great. They're easy. They're free. You can write about anything. It doesn't even have to be programming related. Just the act of writing improves writing on any topic. Communication with clients is very critical if you have clients. They don't like to get emails necessarily that are all badly written, badly formatted, difficult to understand, ambiguous. They like things to be clear. Same thing when you're participating in discussion forums. If you have a question and you ask the question and no one understands what you meant, it's unlikely they're going to be able to help you. And conversely, if you're trying to help someone but they don't understand the answer you gave, well, that's not going to be terribly helpful either. And of course, customers related to clients, you want to be able to talk to them effectively so that they can understand what you're trying to say. Now, know your tools well. Whatever tools you're using, learn them, understand them. First, use the right tools for the job. Xojo is a great tool for many, many types of software projects. After all, it can create cross-platform apps for desktop, Mac, Windows, and Linux, web apps, console apps. It's great. Soon it'll be able to create iOS apps. But if you need to create an Android app, well, you could use a Xojo web app for that. That might work. But if that's not going to work, you need a different tool. It's not the end of the world to sometimes have to pick a different tool. And every developer ought to have a whole bunch of tools in their toolbox, like an auto mechanic does, like a carpenter would. But whatever tools you choose, know them. Understand how they work. In particular, an important tool you want to make sure you're using is source control. I've done webinars on this in the past. The source code is the important thing you're creating, so it should be treated with importance and managed in a source control system. Bug tracking software is also very, very handy. There's lots of free tools available for this. Redmine is one that I particularly like. That's an online tool. There's also Bugzilla, I think, Mantis, I'm forgetting. Probably an infinite number of bug tracking tools that you can get to track information you get back from your customers, or even stuff you're working on internally, so that you know what's fixed, what needs to be fixed, what's going to be in an upcoming release, that sort of thing. Also, project tracking tools are very handy to have an idea of what the upcoming releases are, what sort of things you're going to be putting in them, who's going to be working on them, how long they might take, that sort of thing. Many, many apps use databases. You should understand the database you're using well enough to be able to use it effectively. There's lots of different types of databases, and they all work a little bit differently. So you want to sit down with the one you are using and understand its features. Test early and test often. Nobody does enough testing. Nobody. That's because testing is really, really hard. The most common type of testing is manual testing, where you just kind of fire up your application, you use it a bit, you try out different stuff, see what works. And that, of course, perfectly fine testing. You can also do automatic testing. This is more difficult with apps that have user interfaces. There are some tools out there that can like record mouse movements and clicks and whatnot and kind of simulate a user using your application, but still it can only test a specific pathway. But it can be very helpful for stuff that's rote and that happens commonly and that you want to just have, automatically run through real quickly to make sure things work. Unit testing is a great way to test stuff under the hood that's not user interface related. Like your core components that are doing calculations or database access or stuff like that. Xojo does include a unit test framework in the example projects that you can grab and use in your projects. There's one for desktop, web, and console applications. I also find virtual machines are a great way to test applications because you can have a virtual machine set up with a variety of different operating systems and run your apps on them to see how they function. This is particularly useful with cross-platform tool like Xojo. I must have my VM software. I must have about 30 VMs with varieties of Windows and Linux and OS 10 that I can run things on to test. It's very handy. I don't need a whole office full of computers. I can turn on and off the different virtual machines that I need at certain points in time. Incredibly useful. And of course, you can also have your users help with testing. That can be beta testing, alpha testing, that sort of thing. And users often like to help test because they get to see things before the general public, makes people feel special, and they can help provide guidance on things before they're publicly available. So that's another great way to get testing. All right, I'm going to take a little break now and run our polls and see what we have for questions. All right, our first poll here. I'll run the polls for about 30 seconds or so till it looks like most people have voted, and then we'll move on to the next one. All right, a question here from Amando asking what sort of formal method would I recommend for a solo developer? Agile, XP, lists others. All right, let's answer that after I start the next poll. All right. Well, I guess these days the term you see thrown around the most is probably agile. And I think that term is probably used the most because it kind of is a catch-all for pretty much any combination of method that you throw together to use. But some of its general concepts that I like are just, there's not a lot of formal upfront planning. You just have a general design and you iterate repeatedly. In general, I like that concept, particularly for software. And for a sole developer, that's really easy to do. But it does give you these short iterations. It can be however long you want. I think Agile typically is 2 weeks. And then you build specific things for 2 weeks, and then you iterate and continue that process. So I think that sort of thing works really well. I'm not a big fan of the write a giant spec up front, spend a long time on that, and then spend a long time coding it, and then hopefully when you get to the end, everything matches up. I've done that years ago in the past. I've never really thought that worked terribly well. All right, let's move on to the next poll here. See, Amando's also asking if ship early, shipped often works for Apple Store apps. I think it definitely works for Apple Store apps. When you update often in the App Store, users get updates in the App Store app on the computer that tells them that your app is active, being maintained. So that's always good. When people are looking to buy things, they see that your app, has an update history. It's not just sitting there old and moldy. So yeah, I definitely think that works. I got a question if the slides might be made available for this. Yeah, I think I'll probably make the slides available for this on our usual page on the wiki. I can do that. And let's see, Kev here is suggesting providing estimates in a range. And that's great advice as well. When you give people estimates, rather than saying, well, I expect this to take, 4 hours or 4 days or whatever, you say, well, probably between 2 and 8 hours or some range like that kind of keeps everyone happy. That's a good technique that I've also used. All right, great. I think that's all the polls. And Cliff is noting that comments are a great way to help manage code debt. And which brings up a point we'll talk about coming up here shortly. So let's move on to our next set of slides. Oh, and we already did these. So opinionated programming. Everyone kind of has their own way to code. And there's not a lot of ways that are 100% correct or 100% wrong, but it is important to have your own way of code and have reasons why it's your own way of code and to stick with that. So one of the first things is naming conventions and coding standards. You got to have something like this. Even if you're a solo developer, you got to have something you stick with. You don't want to just be naming things willy-nilly, have your code formatted willy-nilly, and then when you go look at it 6 months from now, not understand it or not be able to make sense of it. You don't want that. And if you're working with other people, it's even more important. Your naming conventions don't have to be a specific thing. Some people like to use that Hungarian notation where the type of all variables is encoded in the name. Some people like to have prefixes at the beginning of variable names. Some people like to put suffix. It doesn't matter. Just pick something and stick with it and be consistent. Coding standards is the same sort of thing. How's your code formatted? Do you have maximum length of methods you try to stay under? Do you have a particular way that you name methods that you try to use? Are they always verbs? Do you not care? Do they always start with M underscore? I wouldn't like that, but it doesn't really matter as long as you get something you're happy with. I always recommend that people initialize variables close to where they are used. Now, you may or may not know that, but with Xojo, you do not have to put your dim statements all at the top of a method. You can put them anywhere within your method, which is pretty much the case with any programming language these days. And it is pretty handy to have your variables declared close to where they're used. Makes it easier to remember what their types are. Makes the block of code easier to read. You can move it around more easily if you need to refactor it into another method. You don't have to go digging around for the variable. It makes it less likely that you're going to have unused variables in your methods because you got a big blob declared at the top that you don't remember if they are all used. It also might help with you making sure your variables only have a single purpose. A common source of bugs is variables that you try to reuse in a method. Oh, well, I got this extra string variable that I declared at the top, and I'm not using it anymore, so I'll use it to store this value down here at the bottom in this other code. Well, that might not be a great idea. You may have forgotten that you reuse that variable. You may have actually thought the value is going to be retained. It could lead to a whole lot of unintended consequences that you don't want. And of course, choose good names for your variables. Like anything else, always choose good names. There's no limit on the length of names with Xojo or pretty much any programming language these days. So short names that are abbreviated don't often have a lot of benefit. Autocomplete sort of thing can fill that stuff in for you if you're a bad typist. But if you're a programmer and you're a bad typist, learn how to type. It'll make your life a lot easier. Of course, enumerations and named constants are the preferred way of referring to actual values that have meaning in your code rather than just embedding the number or the string or whatever directly in your code. That way, if you need to make a change somewhere, you have a single place to do so. Enumerations are great because they're actually typed, so you can't let a variable have a value outside of the enumeration. Unlike with a constant, if it's just an integer value, you could accidentally just assign an actual integer to it, and if it's outside of a range you expect, well, that may not give you results you're happy with. Of course, minimize the use of global data. Sounds like a pretty common thing to say, but you always do need to be thinking about it. It's easy to throw in a module and just start putting all kinds of stuff in it and have all that stuff available throughout your application anywhere you're coding. But that's not always the best idea. Making good uses of classes with things that are marked as private or protected is probably a better way to make sure that your designs are cleaner and less likely to break. Have some ideas of when you prefer to use the if statement versus using a select case statement. Having a giant if statement with a lot of else ifs can get pretty hard for people to read. So you might have some ideas about, well, this has gotten to a point where select case makes more sense. And select case is great. It's pretty easy to read. It's got everything right there laid out in front of you. Things are segregated a little bit better. I generally prefer to use select case, but you should have a rough idea of what you prefer and why you do it. I also like to avoid non-obvious loop and block exits. But I'd notice I said avoid. This is not a hard and fast rule for me, but an example of this would be if you've got a method that has a for loop in it, I may not want to just return from within the for loop, return out of the method from within the for loop. I may prefer to actually just let the for loop terminate and then return outside of it. It's not always the case, but generally I try to avoid these things because if you have multiple exits of a method, it introduces a little bit of code that's a little harder to follow. And that may give you, again, unintended consequences. And unintended consequences in programming almost always equates to a bug at some point in time. For each is a great command to make use of if you're not already. This is used in Xojo to iterate over arrays. So rather than declaring a counter variable and then using that to iterate as the index in an array, you can use for each. It's a lot cleaner syntax. You don't have to maintain things differently. So that's something I always try to use over a regular for loop when I can. Be a master debugger. Learn your debugger. Use it effectively. Xojo has a pretty good debugger that can show you the state of the program at any point, contents of all the variables, that sort of thing, all the open objects. You can use the break statement to do conditional dropping into the debugger. So if a value reaches, if a variable ends up with a certain value, you can put the break statement in your code and it will drop right in the debugger for you. Kind of gives you a little watch point technique. Lots of things you can do with the Xojo debugger. You can also write to logs to get information that might not be as easily accessible in the debugger. I did a debugging webinar earlier this year, so certainly check that out for other tips. I mentioned this earlier, but you can refactor regularly. And that means, always be cleaning up your code. There's no reason not to have code that was better than it was before. And good code is good code. And of course, just iterate over stuff. You don't have to, take apart a particular class or method completely, have it spread out, all over the place and then attempt to put it back together. That'd be like changing your oil by disassembling the engine. That's a little risky. You can do little pieces at a time and just iterate over it. And I prefer to do that. Exceptions, make sure you take advantage of exceptions. This is using the try-catch statement to catch any exceptions that might occur, especially ones that you're that you're expecting, so expected exceptions. You don't want these to just bubble up and end up crashing your app and giving the user a bad experience. And as Cliff mentioned, comment effectively. What's an effective comment? Well, a comment that says above a dim name as string and a comment that says name as a string is not an effective or useful comment. But a comment at the beginning of a method that describes the method's purpose in life and why it exists, or describes the overall algorithm that the method is implementing, or describes why you implemented it in this particular way, that's all very effective and useful comments, especially for people or even you that go to look at something months later and don't remember any of those things that may have seemed completely obvious at the time. You also want to avoid premature optimization. And any programmer is always focused on the nitty-gritty stuff, but you don't want to go in and gung-ho and come up with the world's fastest and best algorithm for something that does not need the world's fastest and best algorithm. It may make your code too complicated to start with. It may take you much longer to finish. So you probably should ignore a lot of that right at the very get-go. Xojo itself has a profiler that you can run on your code after it's written, so you can see if things are taking longer, or you can see the parts of your code that are taking up the most time, is what the profiler is going to tell you. So then you can see if that's a problem, and you can zone in on those specific parts of your code and optimize just those parts, leaving the rest alone. Lastly, make shy code. I think I talked about this a bit in the object-oriented programming webinar from a couple weeks ago, but essentially this means encapsulate well, don't expose everything. That makes your code fragile, easily breakable. So I like to make things private by default, my properties, my methods, even on Windows or whatnot. I just set things to private. Now, not everything can be private. That, of course, is not going to work. But by doing that, it allows me to think before I use any of these things elsewhere. Well, does this really need to be publicly accessible outside of itself? And I can think about that a little bit more, and then I can say, all right, well, it does, but not the whole thing. So maybe I can make that as a computed property instead, or a method. And you can start to come up with a slightly better way for your code to interface with your other code. All right, so enough about opinionated programming. Let's reduce, reuse, and recycle. This, of course, is the mantra of programming. Don't repeat yourself. Why do we all write programs? It's because we're lazy and we don't like doing the same thing over and over. So we write programs so the computer can do that for us. Well, don't repeat yourself in your code. Don't have methods that all do the same thing. Make that a little bit more general. Write negative 500 lines of code rather than an additional 500. Again, less code has less bugs. Design your code so it can be reused. Now, don't go crazy and then, design this entire generic thing that can be reused in any project and is going to take you 6 months to do. If that's going to delay you shipping what you're trying to do, well, limit the reuse appropriately. But it's always good to have code that you can repurpose. And of course, you can always go back and refactor existing code so that you can reuse it. And this is probably a better technique in general. Your code may be specific to start with, but as you're adding more things to your project, you may realize, oh, well, that code I wrote, kind of what I need over here. Let me just, refactor that a little bit so I can use it in both places. And you don't end up having to write a bunch of new code. You just massage some code you already had so that it could be reused. Because copy and paste are not your friends. You don't want to just be copying and pasting chunks of code all over your application, code that could probably be better reused in a more common place. Now, obviously, there's going to be places where you're going to be copying and pasting, but big chunks of code should not be copy and pasted. I mean, what if it ends up that big chunk of code you then copy and pasted in 50 different places has a bug in it? Well, that would be horrible, because now you've got 50 places you've got to go find and fix that bug. And if you miss one, you still got a bug somewhere. So not your friend. And always remember, programming is for people. So people come first. And this means people who are going to use your application, the people you work with to create the application. So I know some people will always focus on, well, this is easier. I'll write it this way because it's easier for the computer. Well, who cares? It's the computer. Write it so it's easier for the people. Be yourself. Have your code and your projects have a personality. It's reflective of yourself. People like that. Unless you're a jerk. If you're a jerk, well, don't be yourself. Be a nice guy instead. Related to that is fix the problem, not the blame. If you're on a team, run into an issue, fix it. Doesn't matter the cause or who did it or why it happened. That's not important. What's important is problem fixed, move on, continue to make the software better. Remember, people are not computers, and computers are not people. So you can't talk to people as if they're a computer. People are not going to be very binary, yes or no, black or white, and computers are. And use the appropriate languages and methods to talk to either group effectively. All right, that wraps up presentation. I got a couple of books I want to recommend here that this presentation is based off of. First one, surprise, surprise, is called The Pragmatic Programmer, which you can grab from here. It's a great book. It's pretty generic. It doesn't specifically use any one programming language. Covers a lot of the things I talked about here and many, many, many other things. It's not a thick book, though. It's pretty thin. I don't have it here to hold up in front of you, but it's just probably a couple hundred pages. But a great book. I also recommend Getting Real from the company formerly known as 37 Signals. I believe they're now called Basecamp. Some great stuff in there on general tips for how to run and think about projects in software development. And a companion book, also by the same folks, is called Rework, that I also recommend. And of course, the big tome, multi-100-page book, Code Complete, which you can grab from here. This is a great book, lots of specific techniques. This is more specifically into the code that you can get some advice. And again, this is not necessarily specific to any one programming language. It has specific code techniques that you can apply to anything, including Xojo, of course. All right, let me switch out of here and check what we have for questions. All right, Justin reminds everyone to read the docs. He had a different way to use select case that he wasn't aware of that he discovered by reading the documentation. Since I wrote the documentation, I do highly encourage people to read it. It makes me feel good when people read it. And then you may find mistakes in it that I can then fix and make it better than it was. Kev also recommends comments about the intent of code. Make your code comments about the intent of the code. And notes that copy paste is a common source of technical debt. I couldn't agree more. And Cliff also recommends the use of the Xojo forum, and it truly is a great place to hang out with other Xojo developers, ask questions, get answers. It's really a great community. And of course, if you like the forum, figure out how you can get yourself over to one of our conferences, because that's like the forum on steroids with the amount of knowledge transfer and cool people you get to meet. All right, let's see here. A few people asking about slides and links. Let me just bring up the Our doc wiki, I'll show you the initial link, is just docs.xojo.com. So you can always just come right here. This has links to everything documentation related, including the user guides and then the actual online language reference or whatnot. But if you scroll down a little bit in the additional information section, we got a link here for our webinars, which you can always click and get a list of all the webinars that are done with any companion example projects. Or in the case of this webinar, I will make the slides available here as well. You can also grab the recording on YouTube for ones that recordings didn't get corrupted. They're not too bad. I think in the year that I've been doing these webinars, I've only had 2 that have had GoToWebinar crash on me. So not horrible, I suppose. I'd prefer it with 0, but what can you do? No software is bug-free, right? And let's see. And Pascal is asking just to see the first slide again. Let's see, which one was that, Pascal? I think it was this one. So there it is. And like I said, I will have the slides uploaded and available today. So feel free to check the website. They should pop up later in the day today. The recording will take a little while to process, barring any issues, but it should be available this week, definitely. And I got a question here from Justin asking if people want to see an in-depth webinar on managing Xojo projects with Git. I'm going to read that as Justin volunteering to do a guest webinar on that. I do have several people here saying yes to that, Justin. And I'm sure I will take him up on that in the next round of webinars that start up in August. All right, so I got a lot of comments on that, Justin. Seems like a lot of people would like to see something like that. All right, well, that looks like the end of the questions here. I will just bring up the book links one last time. But again, you can just grab these slides in a couple hours and get all the information, links or whatnot directly from them that you need. I want to thank everyone for attending this week's webinar. And of course, many more are coming up in July. So stay tuned for those and have a great rest of your day.